Tim Hawthorne here. Glad you could join me for another Druidry based ramble. I'm back here in the garden. I thought I'd do a bit of an update on last month's video. This hasn't suddenly turned into a gardening channel, if any of you are wondering. It's just that this is, this is the prime expression of Druidry for me. Now, somebody came and looked at it recently and they said, they described it as a permaculture garden. And that got me thinking, because I didn't set out to do permaculture. And so for that reason, almost that reason alone, this isn't really permaculture. But it got me thinking, and I thought I'd go and actually find out a bit more about permaculture and talk a little bit about the similarities and the differences between permaculture and Druidry, because there is a definite crossover. And I've also taken quite a lot of ideas from the permaculture world. Permaculture is essentially a design philosophy and an approach to land management. It's not just about gardening. In fact, it's not really necessarily about gardening at all. Its ethics are based on care for the earth and all of its life systems, which is very much in tune with Druidry. It's also about care for people. Now, we might talk a little bit more in terms of service to the community, but it's quite similar. Its third ethic, setting limits to population and consumption, sharing the surplus, that's not specifically Druidry. So this is where permaculture kind of varies. I mean, it's a design philosophy. Druidry is a spiritual philosophy. So obviously there are some quite big differences. It has 12 main principles, 4 of which definitely do sort of resonate with a Druidic approach. Some of the others, maybe not quite so much. The 4 are, the first principle really is to observe and interact with nature. And this is the core to Druidry. I mean, the starting place and probably the resting place, the end place of Druidry is find a spot in nature, preferably sat under a tree or something like that. Your garden is perfectly fine. If you haven't got access to nature in that way, use your imagination. That's also totally cool. It's not quite the same as sitting in nature, let's be honest, but for most of you watching this video, that's what you're going to have to do, is imagine that you're sat here with me. Hi. That's the starting point. You find yourself a spot in nature and just observe and experience nature. And in the same way, we believe that you can use the patterns of nature, the watching the way nature solves problems, to inspire us to solve other kinds of problems. It's I call it the Chancy Gardener approach, if any of you are familiar with being there. That's actually quite a deep story in some ways. I've done what I could with what I've got here, so that's a kind of permaculture thing, isn't it? Use and value renewable resources and services, it says here. Make the best of nature's abundance. And I think, I think I can reasonably say that's what I've done here. Produce no waste, use everything. Well, I've got a little plastic bag of rubbish over there, but most of it goes on the compost heap. Yeah, those terms, permaculture and Druidry are very similar things, and permaculture talks about learning lessons from indigenous cultures. Now, indigenous is a bit of an odd word. I always feel these sort of Latin terms make everything seem rather biological. Druidry is Britain's native religion, so yeah, there's a synergy there. Where permaculture varies is they talk about catching and storing energy. It's about obtaining a yield, integrating elements, using small, slow solutions, valuing diversity, using edges. I mean, that's very, specific to permaculture. Creatively use and respond to change. Well, yeah, we could do. That's got some relationship with Druidry, but it's not the same thing. It's a design philosophy. It's about how you manage spaces, and there's a lot more. There's a lot more to Druidry, and I want to talk a little bit about what makes Druidry different. I will mention before I get into that, one of the main practices that I have cherry-picked from permaculture, if you like, is no-dig. Using all these beds here were started off using sheet mulch, cardboard and compost, very much in the style of Charles Dowding, who's just down the road. Thank you, Charles. Very much appreciate your guidance on this one. So compost production is absolutely central to this. It's, if I didn't have this additional space, which we've just mowed and thrown a whole pile on the compost heap there, which will now heat up and, break down much faster over the rest of the next 3 weeks or so before I turn it, probably. And so I'm also doing things like crop rotation, intercropping. I've just put some sunflowers behind me. I've just put some sunflowers in between the beans, things like that. So this month we've seen an incredible abundance of growth. You can probably see the difference from my previous video, New Moon in June. Here we are coming up to full moon in July, and the flowers have come out. The hollyhocks are looking absolutely splendid. As I mentioned, the marigolds, and you can see all the vegetables have really come on, and I've harvested quite a lot of broad beans. The turnips have all gone now, and I'm raising some kohlrabi to plant in its place. So yeah, those aspects of permaculture definitely go into what I'm doing here. One of the things that I do, and I've sort of touched on it a bit, is I work by the moon. And this is very Druidic. It's not absolutely specific to Druidry. You can work by the moon, whatever your faith or not. One of the tenets of permaculture is to disturb the soil as little as possible. And this is definitely an idea that I follow. And working with the moon gives a timetable. So during this period, these sort of 2 weeks either side of the full moon, I try to disturb not only the soil, but actually disturb the plants as little as possible. I do a little bit of harvesting, but mostly I'm not moving things around. The week before the new moon, coming up to the new moon, is the time for doing the weeding, for digging things up, for pruning stuff. That's, if it's the right time of year, that is, but that's the time for disturbance. And then just after the new moon is when I sow seeds and plant new plants out. The ideal is to sow seeds when the moon is in an earth sign or a water sign. Now I've got a bit slack on that this year. I found it just a little bit fussy, and I've reverted to doing things with my intuition. So I tend to just, the first day after the new moon feels like a sowing day. that's when I'll do my sowing. Sometimes it takes 2 or 3 days to get it all done. And I'm experimenting. I don't know whether there's any real science behind this. I mean, we know that the moon affects the water in our bodies. It draws, it is responsible for the movement of sap in plants. And so the idea is that when we get to new moon, the sap is at its lowest in the month. And, the growth energy, the outward and upward flowers and leaves growth energy is going to happen around full moon. So that's the time we want to disturb as little as possible. And if we need to disturb stuff, we'll do that around the new moon. Obviously, the moons change every year. This year, we're getting a new moon right at the beginning of the month, which means the full moon is happening in the middle of the month. That's not necessarily the case every year. Now, this year's kind of special because it's the golden year 11. Every 19 years, the cycles of the moon and sun almost match up. There's a 2 and a bit hour discrepancy. So maybe 100 years time, we might need to sort of rejig things slightly. So the way I reckon it, now this is very much a sort of Druidic reckoning. I would actually run the cycle from new moon on winter solstice through to new moon on winter solstice. That actually happens at the end of the Christian golden year 1. Christians also keep track of the Metonic cycle in order to help with the dating of Easter. Now, the dating of Easter is actually relevant because we kind of start sowing around Easter. Traditionally, the Easter full moon is the time when you're going to plant your potatoes, and that seems a reasonable thing. As you know, some years Easter's early. This year Easter was quite early. Next year Easter's going to be relatively late, and so some gardeners might decide to put their potatoes in slightly before Easter next year. What it means is we've just had a full moon the day after solstice, a day and a bit after solstice this year. And that's because this year comes right in the middle of the entire Metonic cycle. Starting off, if we started at new moon at winter solstice, full moon at summer solstice is the absolute slap bang in the centre. And having a full moon that close to the solstice means that we're going to get 4 full moons before autumn equinox. So if you get 4 full moons between the solstice and the equinox, or the equinox and solstice, whichever way you're counting, the 3rd full moon out of those 4 full moons is classed as a blue moon. This is the astronomical way of dealing with a blue moon. Blue moons are a kind of calendrical thing, but they are based on a real phenomena, the actual movement of the sun and the moon. They don't rely on the Gregorian calendar. As Druids, we're kind of less concerned about calendrical dates and much more concerned about actually looking at the sky and seeing what the sun and the moon and the various bodies are actually doing. So this is astronomical. The 3rd full moon out of 4 full moons in an astronomical season, that's the time between solstice and equinox, is the blue moon. And contrary to what some Wiccans will tell you, that we don't have 13 moons, full moon cycles in the year. We have 12 moon cycles plus about 11 days, so 12 and a third lunar cycles. These add up, and so every 2 3/4 years, it's about 33 lunations, we will get an extra blue moon. Otherwise, we go through a cycle of 12 different moon names. Now, I use the old English moon names, such as I understand them. Many of you will be used to hearing the names from the Farmer's Almanac, which is American, and mixes up sort of Old English moon names with some of the native names from kind of northeast around the Great Lakes area, as I understand it. Correct me if I'm wrong. So the Easter moon for me is the seed or egg moon. You might have heard of that as being the pink moon. In April we get the hare moon, which could be, some people call the flower moon. May is the strawberry moon. And then in June, the one we've just passed, it will be the mead moon. Now, yes, there's a discrepancy between the Farmer's Almanac and the way I'm doing it, and I'll explain that in a minute. And so this full moon we're coming up to now in July will be the corn moon. And the mead moon is sometimes known as the buck moon, and this moon is sometimes known as the sturgeon moon. I think these are native things, but the British one is to call this one the corn moon, because this is when the corn starts to ripen in the fields. And then the next moon in August will be the blue moon. It doesn't have a name other than that. That is the blue moon. That's the 13th moon of the cycle. Following that, on the 18th of September, just before autumn equinox, we will have the harvest moon. The moon nearest the autumn equinox is always the harvest moon in both the Farmer's Almanac and the Old English, because that's where it comes from. And the moon after that, on the 17th of October, is the hunter's moon, always the hunter's moon. And this nearly always coincides with Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, which will be the 2nd of October to the 4th of October, starting on the new moon, with the full moon on the 17th. Following on from that, the next cycle is the dead moon. The American name is the beaver moon. The dead moon starts on the 1st of November, and that coincides with Diwali, and the full moon will be on the 15th. And the oak moon will start on the 1st of December and be full on the 15th. So just 3 moons there, winter solstice, and then we're going to have a very late Hanukkah. Hanukkah doesn't begin until Christmas Day this year, 25th, and will run on to the 2nd of January. So that kind of ends around what for us is the wolf new moon in the 30th of December, and that will be full the 13th of January 2025. Just to complete the cycle, the next one is the storm moon. The new moon will coincide with the Tibetan New Year, Losar and Imbolc, and that'll be full on the 12th of February. And then we've got the chaste moon on the 28th, 14th of March. It'll be full just before spring equinox again, and we'll have a late Easter next year. So that's how lunar cycles kind of work. And what it means for us this year is, because we're getting a blue moon, that means we're getting an extra lunar cycle in the second half of the year. During the harvest season, we're getting 4 months rather than 3. And this gives us the possibility of having an extra harvest. Maybe, we might be able to harvest 1 more cycle. Still going to have to get it in the ground this month or next month in order to stand a chance of harvesting before all the growing energy disappears. If you're enjoying my content, please like, subscribe, leave a comment, and just let me know how you feel about planting by the moon, whether you've got experience with permaculture, I don't know, whatever. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.